Hey everybody, I'm Marcus Hazelwood, and welcome to Clear Haze Exchange. I'm an energy engineer with over 15 years of experience in sustainability and energy efficiency consulting. Many find these topics a little complex, so I created Clear Haze Exchange to help provide clear, actionable insight. Clearing the haze, so to speak. We'll cover plenty of topics under the umbrella of energy efficiency and sustainability. Let's get into today's conversation. Welcome, listeners, to Season 2 of Clear Haze Exchange, where we're focusing on uncovering the hidden systems and constraints that shape sustainability outcomes. Today's guest I'm really excited to have a conversation with is Jon Lemmond of JLL, where he helps organizations translate energy efficiency and decarbonization goals into sound strategies across complex real estate portfolios. With more than 20 years of experience spanning energy engineering, facilities, operations, policy, and portfolio scale execution, Jon works at the intersection of buildings, energy systems, and leasing, advising tenants and owners navigating the energy transition in real time. And he's in New York as well. So, Jon, welcome to the show. Welcome.
Thanks, Marcus. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Glad to have you. I know we had pushed this conversation because of the snow excitement that happened last week for you.
Never seen so much snow in New York in my 10 winters here. It was a lot, but we made it through.
Yep. Just like at the same time, I was recovering from winter colds from my kids, germs spreading. So that's always fun with winter.
Is the season. Yep.
Yeah. One of the things I noticed you had posted on your LinkedIn, you did a post about moving your family from an apartment building and being on the board to help improve that building. And I think it was in Brooklyn, New York. And tell me a little bit about that. How you're beyond just preaching and pushing energy efficiency, not only from a business standpoint, you're doing that personally. And why is that?
Thanks for bringing that up. The reason I do that was volunteer work, joining my co-op board, was to drive improvements. I lived there. I had great neighbors in that building. And we are all sharing the energy bill. We're all, complaining of it being overheated and worried about maintenance and operations. And I'm driven by implementing decarbonization. So I learned living in a co-op with included low-income housing in the building. The co-op board was critical to getting implementation done. So I took a lot of noise complaint calls as a co-op board during the pandemic. Sheila in apartment 9F and too many cats, and I had to deal with that. Through all that co-op board position requirements, I was able to get some really great energy projects done. Our building is A-rated. We're not going to be liable for any Law 97 fines, and we are much more energy resilient than we were.
That's good. That's good. I did a little bit of work in New York myself, and local law 97 is a law on, at least on the commercial side, it's moving towards carbon fining. So if you could talk a little bit about that local law 97 law and what it means, not only from that personal experience, but on a business side, what is New York City doing?
It's a carbon tax in a sense, and
Okay.
it's really moved from planning and benchmarking to implementation and enforcement at this moment in time. So when I served on the board back in 2020, 2021, I was able to refer to it when convincing a board of volunteers who are responsible for how to spend the reserves of a building, how to spend money in the building. And I was able to say, this law coming down the pike will impact us financially in a negative way. If we don't get ahead of it and make some investments in our building, that will benefit all of us. So it was a great tool as an advocate on a board to get things done.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So, from where you sit, where do decarbonization ambitions most often break down once companies move into leased spaces? It's a bit different than commercial building that an organization might own. In larger cities, there's a lot of leased space in larger buildings. So, where do decarbonization ambitions most often break down once companies move into this lease space?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, moving from my personal volunteer work to my professional work at JLL, we manage billions of square feet of commercial real estate globally. And if I'm involved, it's because a JLL client is investing in energy efficiency, resiliency, and decarbonization. Pretty much all of my clients have a portfolio that has a mix of owned and leased space. So the first and most obvious place that decarbonization ambitions get broken down is when real estate and sustainability leaders prioritize where across their portfolio they want to invest their capital, energy, and effort. So, in that those initial determinations of investment, um, they tend to go towards their owned assets and deprioritize these assets. I mean, successful decarbonization is hard. And getting decarbonization in a known site is relatively easy. So I think many folks should focus effort on working on the relatively easy projects first. So all that to say, you usually first see that breakdown in where the actual capital and focus is delivered.
Mm. And the thought of control over base building systems. You're coming in to lease a space on the 30th floor where you're looking at just two floors, but there's a big chiller in the building, a big boiler in the building. Thinking about scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are associated with that resource consumption on electricity, gas, natural resources. How does that less control piece fit in from the mentality, and what are you thinking? What do you encourage a lot of your clients to think about in these kind of cases?
Yeah, I mean, this is a historical challenge of a split incentive and legacy leasing where tenants pay the utility bills, but owners pay for the buildings and the equipment. What's important to remember is that there are shared goals for decarbonization and energy efficiency. Unlike any time in history, there is now more pressure on both landlords and occupiers, landlords and tenants, uh, to decarbonize, to be energy efficient. So that split incentive and that tension, it can come from the lease, the lease language and clauses in the lease that set the rules for how energy is consumed and how people build. But those constraints don't have to exist. And I've seen the yields tend to overcome. So look, we can talk more about that.
Yeah, yeah. So moving into this conversation around the tenant realities in commercial real estate. Many companies have ambitions in climate change, but how would you address how commitments can still align if the company has limited control over base building systems like I mentioned? Where does the tension show up first?
It's felt by all three, by multiple teams. So the tension shows up on the facilities teams that's on the front lines of managing the client goals. So if there's a facilities team in the building and suddenly their client, the owner of the building, says, "Hey, we got to be net zero and we got to make it happen." They're on the front lines of managing that, whether or not they have the equipment and resources and the technology to do it with the manpower. The finance team, to meet energy efficiency and decarbonization, they will have to pay for investment in buildings. Now, there's ways around it, third-party capital or energy as a service, infrastructure as a service. But if you do not carbonize your building and there's the split incentive working against it to happen, building property value can go down. So it's more than just a operational. If that split incentive is there, and both parties don't sit down together and collaborate to eliminate those split incentives, then you risk having a stranded asset.
Mm, that's good.
So it shows up the nuts and bolts in the facilities teams, shows up on the finance, on the books, and then let alone the sustainability teams that are responsible for reporting and meeting those goals. They'll have team as well.
Yeah, so it's kind of that early stage involvement of understanding that, look, we're looking to partner with you on this pursuit of achieving climate goals, separate from what you may not be able to control. We are looking to efficiently align, with many of the ones out there, and I think it speaks to um, Local Law 97. It's not just you moving into a building that has systems that are out of your control. Regulation is involved, and then companies like yourself with JLL, where already has those ambitions and understand how to achieve those. So in a way, they're kind of getting into a space that's managed by JLL that already has the tools to help them get there and move their ambitions, which is not always the case with other buildings and other firms. Would you say that's fair? Do a lot of, I guess, companies provide that same kind of support in this area?
Well, what is unique about JLL for me and why I like working here as far as our ability to implement decarbonization is that we are operating a lot of buildings. So we can take that operator's mindset to advising on design support, for advising on decarbonizing pathways, to advise on, you know, leasing strategies and what type of lease and what lease clauses should we implement to achieve our sustainability goals. I think a lot of consultants will lack that operator's mindset, um, because getting the certified building is great, the LEED Platinum or the Energy Star certified or whatever. It's great, but then the building's going to exist for decades, and someone's got to operate it to meet that net zero goal or to meet that highly efficient goal. And energy creeps in buildings unless you maintain it in a world class manner. So by taking that mindset to energy advisory, we have a unique perspective here at JLL.
That's good. That's good. That's one of the focuses of this season is thinking about long term versus that initial capital investment on sustainable, which in most cases it is sustainable design or renovation. It is very important that that early stage design can match long term operations because you're investing, a lot of money up front. But then are you maintaining that ROI? And it seems like JLL is a unique case of having to carry that burden in many cases. And some organizations have the investment in needing to maintain, but it often can slip because they're not their business model isn't focused on that. So it's a really good point. But with that said, what are the most common myths that tenants make about their ability to influence energy performance?
Yeah. One big myth that a lot of tenants have is that they have little to no ability to impact energy performance, even if they're paying for it. I mean, recent JLL research, we know that there's rent premiums of 7 to 10% for green certified Class A office stock. When the split incentive exists, there's that myth that they cannot impact energy performance, which is not true. Also, there's the myth that lease administrators are familiar with the energy and sustainability goals and with the realities of how energy consuming, producing, and storing systems are operated. You got to bring people to the table early, but it's very easy to overcome. If you just let a lease happen, you'll be stuck with the results. But you can't assume that you're just going to get great terms on a lease.
Yeah, that's good. So how with that said, how early in the leasing process should energy and decarbonization conversations realistically start? Are you outlining this in presenting a lease agreement, and why is it that this could be often missed? Is it a conversation that is brought up early on intentionally on your end, or is it something that is later on into the lease conversation?
It's good to start having those conversations early in the process. And it's often, missed because of that myth we previously discussed. But it's critical to establish that partnership between landlords and tenants to establish shared goals. It could include regulatory compliance, market competitiveness, or meeting employee expectations. More and more employees expect their companies to meet their decarbonization goals. So also, to meet early, you have to establish how both parties will communicate. So it's important you get the right stakeholders at the table early. And define what data needs to be shared and set objectives to minimize that split incentive imbalance. Um, it, I think it's important to mention who the important stakeholders are to include early. And, for a lease can be for a new location, moving into a new location, or for a renewal. And for a new location, you got to include the transaction management professionals, occupancy planners, the energy managers, and key facility team members who will be operating the building, any project teams that may be responsible or required for fit out. That's all before the legal and lease administration teams are necessarily involved. It's often missed because folks often mistakenly think that a lease or lease renewal is simply a moment in time, that the lease signing is the entire event. This is the lease date. This one time you sign. It's not just an event. There's work and opportunity for collaboration before and actions required afterward to best meet the tenant and landlord goals.
That's good. That's good. So thinking about the decarbonization within the constraints that I mentioned earlier around when a tenant doesn't have control over that central HVAC system, the building envelope, major infrastructure, where can meaningful decarbonization still happen on the tenant side?
Yeah, great question. So there's a lot tenants can do. Um, there are three things tenants can control always. The energy, well, not always, but usually the energy they use. So whatever the energy they use in their space, the energy they buy, and their procurement strategies and actions, and also the things and services they buy and their other scope 3 emissions, which is often the biggest. The embedded carbon in what they buy. Um, so to control the energy they use, it's not rocket science often. It's making sure to turn off or turn down any electricity or gas consuming equipment within your control. Kilowatt hour saved at the site just by turning something off is much more financially valuable than that kilowatt hour that you buy and offset. So, there's an easy check. Do a night audit. Sure, lights are off weekends and nights. And make sure they have occupancy controls. And make sure that the landlord, if you come on a weekend and the lights are on, maybe the landlord we contract with Butron or a controls vendor, a lighting controls vendor that includes service. Have them come out, meet you there, adjust your schedule. It's an easy savings, free money and as far as what you buy, tenants can engage on community solar subscriptions, green tariffs, disagreements. It's easier to do things on site and these off site renewable power solutions when you collaborate and engage with your landlord, but there's still actions you can take when you don't have control and you're stuck in a lease.
That's good. That's good. And I also think about beyond scope 1 and 2 emissions, there is also scope 3, but it's ongoing consumables, things that you're purchasing, understanding the supply chain behind what you're ordering to bring into the office. Just from a recent conversation with another guest, the weight on that scope 3 even includes travel. I think there's a lot to speak to how tenants can get involved in decarbonization, like you're saying, being conscious, again, from a personal perspective of how am I managing my house? Why shouldn't I do the same at my office? So, and all those things, in most cases, I have the ability to somewhat control, whether it's the temperature and the lighting, like you said. That's good. So, how do you prioritize actions that are worth doing now versus those that require owner alignment or lease renewal?
Yeah. Yeah. We prioritize actions that offer the most bang for the buck. Because you can always get alignment there. And for some clients, we prioritize actions that often offer the most carbon for the buck, but it usually ties back to dollars. So in New York City, where I am, and in other municipalities with building performance standards, ROI and carbon are intertwined
Mm.
because of, New York, we have local law 97, but there's other building performance standards. Um, I mentioned a lighting example, and one easy thing to do as a facilities professional that I've done in lease space is to review all existing vendor contracts for lighting, HVAC services, testing and balancing, or anything else related to any energy consuming or building envelope association. Because they can often include service that isn't taken advantage of. So you lean in on those contracts and get experts there to help you implement energy savings. That's a real easy. That's one thing I prioritize.
Yeah. How much on the glazing, shades, and different things like that on large buildings that may be a floor that you get a lot of sun and you got large windows? What could be done on the side of shading, and what are there lease limitations in what you're putting on the windows or regulatory requirements?
There can be lease limitations on what you can put on the outside of the building. Um, glazing is a pretty cheap and easy way to reduce your heat load in your space. But if the split incentive is there, for example, and a tenant is not paying for base building heating and cooling, that's a tough time talking a tenant to paying for that measure, especially if you don't have metering capabilities. If you're not paying for the energy you consume. So we'll get into that, why that's so important and how to make sure that happens. But I'm generally for decarbonization buildings, the science is clear. It's that if you're going to get to a net zero building, you got to go outside in. So you start with the envelope, make the envelope as sealed and then insulated. And if you can't change the design because it's already existing, so be it. But if you have control of the design for new construction, you make that envelope as um, amenable to net zero as possible, so that then you can size down the heating and cooling as much as possible.
And what would you say that from your experience is the most underutilized lever that tenants have to influence base building performance?
Lease renewal, a very underutilized lever tenants. And if you're in a long lease and it's on your radar, but it's not for a few years out, you don't necessarily have to wait to take action. One common recommendation I have is to write a memorandum of understanding. So that is a great, call it a pre-lease. It can establish a non-legally binding agreement to work on to provide a faster route to agreement without needing to amend the lease. It can say, hey, we're both incentivized to reduce energy consumption. This is how we're going to pay for any retrofits. We're going to pay for 70%. The landlord's going to pay for 30%. There's many different models, But if you write something in that memorandum, that can then improve the communication, give you something to both work on with the shared goal. Another underutilized lever is co-investment for mutual benefit. So if you can build that into your lease, decarbonization benefits both landlord and tenant. And so you design the investment strategies for a retrofit that benefits both fairly. So that both share the investment and both share the benefit. And I mean, an underutilized levers are also submetering and data sharing. So if I'll call it the worst case scenario for a lease space from an energy management perspective is if it's a multi-tenant building and you're not paying for the energy you use, you're paying based on square footage. If you have 1/5 of the building, you pay 1/5 of the energy bill, no matter how much you use. So if there's an energy hog in the building, you're paying for them. That's why it's so important to have submetering of requirement that you pay based on what you use.
That's a really good point because you can't really manage what you don't measure. And that seems like a very critical point for a lease agreement because, like you said, I don't want to be in a building where someone could care less about their energy use. They just use it up, and we're down here trying to conserve our energy. So that's a really good point. So do you see a lot of that an increase in the submeters, and is the utility supporting that? And in terms of capital, like how is that progressing?
Yeah, it's being required by some code and laws, local laws. Um, it is progressing. It's getting easier. Um, I think it's just a critical lease clause that you're seeing more and more. And I think the industry has gotten educated to it over the years that how important it is. And in industrial space, of course, I mean, power is a critical path to finding an industrial space and leasing an industrial space. I mean, that's a whole another conversation, but um, that path to power in leasing of industrial space, you can't get there without the defining power requirements and expectations and access to power.
Mm. That's good. So thinking about that leasing, this topic of leasing and alignment is another piece. Is aligning both with the landlord and also aligning internally as an organization with what sustainability or decarbonization goals are noted. And then from there, looking at then negotiating those within leases. So how are energy and decarbonization expectations changing lease negotiations today because of this topic that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, this has changed significantly since I started doing this work. For one, with the rise of building performance standards, I mean, ensuring compliance with them is changing these negotiations. And even in municipalities without building performance standards, we can say, why don't we just comply with some of these, base level build performance standards requirements of from other jurisdictions, in case one comes in place. So, I'll talk about two more impacts to lease negotiation: access to reliable power and access to sites that are already green. So, access to power, macro energy was in the US and the other countries are contributing to demand out supply. This is especially impactful for lease negotiations in industrial and data center and other high load occupants. And I've heard this around JLL lately. The traditional real estate mantra of location, location, location. It's increasingly giving way to location, resilience, reliability. It's about power. And it's valuable. Um, So in Silicon Valley, the market for industrial and data center sites, our our research shows that high power leases, access to high voltages, reliable power, they've transacted at 49% higher on average than other leases signed over the past 3 years, and 33% higher than rents achieved by the newest of buildings within the last 3 years.
Wow.
You know, A- and green premiums. That is also changing these negotiations. And what I mean by green premiums is that we've shown that energy efficient buildings, decarbonized buildings are in high demand, and we can't retrofit buildings fast enough to keep up with that demand. So they garner higher, much higher, and sites that are energy unreliable have to be leased at a discount. So those factors are um, levers in lease negotiations that landlords can use to garner more rent, or tenants can use to get this kind of space that they want, that is aligned with their corporate goals.
Wow. So the heavy influence in understanding the infrastructure, the status of this infrastructure. But decarbonization doesn't always just mean decarbonizing, but you're saying it also means dollar values because you're able to operate that infrastructure more efficiently, handing over those benefits to the tenants because their operating is less, especially in industrial spaces. So is that transfer, is that dollar transfer stand as kind of the leader in that green leasing space, you would say?
Yeah, if the green lease is done right, I mean, and by right I mean collaboratively, in ongoing communication between landlord and tenant to get to those common goals and share in the value that a more sustainable building brings. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 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 it does, it does, and it kinda moves into the next question to where, thinking a little bit more about you said it depends. And of course, because you have to make sure you're aligning properly with that lease agreement. You can call it a green lease, but what is the value inside of that? So, what clauses, data access rights, or operating provisions make the biggest difference in long term performance? Because when we're thinking about long term performance, you're talking about being in a space for a long period of time, paying those operational costs. So what clauses or data access rights or operating provisions make the biggest difference in that long-term performance?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of clauses, potential clauses. The most progressive clauses are very thoughtful and specific to the goals of both. I'll get into a few examples, but the green lease can align the intent to align the landlord and tenants on a shared mission, operating the space sustainably throughout the lease term, clear responsibilities and incentives for each party. So, some examples. I'll say one thing that I think is key. It's not just me. Clauses around data sharing and metering provisions are very important. You got to include clauses to share that energy and sustainability data to meet corporate objectives and contribute to certifications. Um, Submetering, we talked about this before, but submetering for individual lease space is a very important. Can't control what you don't. You can't set the goals against if you're not measuring it. Another important are funding clauses. Green leases to structure new models for financing building retrofits with clauses to divide costs equitably based on which party receives the benefit or bears the burden of improvements. So a year or two ago, we published some research called Green Tipping Point, where we get a case study of a JLL client with financial services tenant in a U.S. market with limited availability of carbon space, and they co-funded a net zero carbon retrofit with their landlord. and they amortize that investment over a 15-year lease term for 7% lease premium. So they had to work that out prior to that moment where you sign the lease, to that lease event. And I'll give you another example of a funding clause. It's a global energy company that renewed its lease on a site in England. And it's different than the previous example I gave in that as the tenant, they agreed to finance energy improvement works that would help meet their corporate targets. And in exchange, they got reduced rent because it was still increased the value of the property, which benefited the landlord. And so they were able to negotiate that.
It expands my thinking beyond just leasing a space to run your business. It goes beyond that. It's how can it benefit both parties involved. Is a really good point and an example because it's I think often we can limit ourselves to what what the service is. Oh, I want to lease a space. I want to build it out to our likings, to our needs. But how can we work together is a whole different conversation. And if it's going into this, go ahead. How can it
Yeah,
work together?
exactly. I mean, and I was going to say one third type of clause that's really important, just to your point, communication and building management clause. So I think it's important to lay out early what kind of communication there's going to be between the landlord and tenant and codify it. Those have proven to be the most effective, creating consistent opportunities to review strategies and progress made. So I think those are key clauses. There's more, but I'll leave it at that.
I'm sure there's plenty.
You teed
It,
me up based on
Yeah, well, the piece around Local Law 97, where companies need to report their energy and they need to understand the owner of the building is responsible for that carbon reporting. So if you have 20 tenants in a building, explain how you navigate that, and has it progressed to become easier to navigate when you're talking about data access rights? I'm sure they have to sign a clause in there for releasing their energy information, but you have the overall. So how does that work?
well, you can report whole building consumption. So it can be really tough to gather all that information. In multifamily buildings, I remember you have to you have to have a certain number of apartments to avoid getting privacy issues with individual occupants. Um, for commercial buildings, Class A commercial office, at least in Local Law 97, you know, you've come a long way in getting that sub-metered data. So nobody wants to pay Local Law 97. Um, it's- there are some owners out there that are just paying them because they haven't the inertia of will to make it happen. But I that's the minority. So getting that sub-metered clause in there and getting those reporting clauses in there for your tenants um, is becoming much more common.
That's good. That's good. I would think it would have to, just given the the weight of what these regulations are, and they're pushing to, for buildings to be better, existing buildings to use energy better. It's not just a regulation around trying to fine New Yorkers and business owners just because there is a value and it plays into the ROI. So I think, and that's why a lot of different cities are pushing for this. I think New York is leading the charge. I was in Boston for a while. It's called BERDO, Building Energy Reporting Disclosure or ordinance or something like that. And then in Maryland, there's BEPS. There's a lot of these regulatory requirements that are pushing building owners to use their energy more efficiently. And I think that's certainly a value, but that piece of measurement and accountability and making the decisions that are involving communication with that partner, whether it's an owner, a tenant, a landlord, or just across departments within your organization it adds a lot of value. Any other things around that measurement piece? Because there's so many points that we can touch on, and like you said, there's so many clauses you can add in. But what else do you think around that topic of measurement and accountability, in the decisions that have to be made? Do you think are important?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm, some tenants will find themselves in a building, or there'll be a champion, a company that's a tenant, and they feel like they don't have a lot of control, or the sustainability professional. So when you do have that limited control, and you start to feel like, oh, there's nothing I can do, that's not the case. So take your success where you can, whether in scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions. And if you're not measuring your 1, 2, and 3, measure them. And if one avenue is, if you can't get chilled water system optimization on the base building, for example, or do retro commissioning because it's the landlords, um, then go another route. Consider your scope team. See if you have procurement opportunities, or whether the energy you procure, the electricity you procure, or in what you buy, the services and products you buy, and make sure you know what the carbon impact of, of your scope 3 emissions as well.
Yeah. That's good. So wrapping this up, that again, there's so much here to discuss, but what would you say is one mindset shift that tenants could make immediately that would improve their energy outcomes? It sounds like tenants need to think outside of the box, but what would you say a mindset shift could be?
Yeah, I mean, a mindset shift that I think is, there is a lot within the tenant control, more than it may seem. And to get to action, it's important to have greater landlord occupier, greater landlord tenant engagement beyond just the lease agreement. If you're stuck in a lease, understand your landlord's goals and pressures that they have. They have pressures from investors. They have pressures to decarbonize. They have pressures to review their leases, their buildings leased. And, great tenants want decarbonized spaces. So there's a lot within control. And again, if you're stuck in a lease, you can understand those goals of the landlord, see which of those goals are also important to you as the tenant, and write a memorandum of understanding to your landlord. Communicate with them, work it out, and see what actions can be taken as a result of the understand your goals.
That's good. Well, I appreciate the conversation, John. There's so many great nuggets here in understanding the lease side of things. The last question I have for you, and looking ahead, what gives you confidence that tenant-driven sustainability can meaningfully shape the built environment? Because you said it's an important responsibility, and it's not as limited as people may think.
I love the question. I am confident that we can continue to improve the built environment, and tenants can drive sustainability because everyone is incentivized. So your landlords, they have pressure from the banks, they have pressures from vendors, they have pressures from institutions. They want to improve tenant satisfaction. They want to be able to charge more rent. So they're incentivized. And, occupiers, they're incentivized to take action as well. It's good for business. They have pressure from employees, they have pressures from the board and from customers. You want to improve the well-being for employees. You want to lower operating costs. So it's just a question of communication and collaboration to align those. That gives me confidence. There's not really a downside. That's what gives me the most confidence.
Another question, for the last one. Since 2020, there's been a shift in that, the owners, buildings, especially, in the, lease spacing, and occupying, the office space. It's changed much. What do you think the shift has happened? What positive things can you say? Is it, increased back since the decline of, people being in the office? What is the climate right now in the lease space?
In a sense, the toothpaste is out of the tube on the hybrid work model after the pandemic, right? We've learned that in many instances, it's good for employees. And if you want to retain top talent in some industries, you got to enable that hybrid working model. And at the same time, flip side of that, it's easier to do the job when you're in the office and around your colleagues. So we have, I would say in the past few years, the shared work and the way we fit buildings out. And the JLL office in Midtown Manhattan is a great example of this. I love going there. You want to enable collaboration. You want to enable people to have privacy and private conversations and HR conversations, and you need to have flexible meeting rooms. The workplace has just evolved so much, I think, as a result of the pandemic. And the other really important thing, it has to be healthy. So the places we go to for work, you're seeing the rise of a lot of well certifications, having some food, drinks, and social events. They're good for people. And so when things are good for you, for your health, mind, you're a better worker. So we're seeing office spaces step up on amenities and making the office a more pleasant place to be. And that's how we do better work.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thanks, Jon, for the conversation. I really appreciate your insight and perspective on this topic of leasing spaces in this energy and sustainability world. Hopefully, the audience have gained a lot of value from this beyond the surface of what limitations you may think you might have, the importance of communicating with your landlords around leases, which make all the difference in the world, it sounds like, and understanding green leases. These are all valuable. Thanks for joining again, Jon.
Marcus, thanks so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate it. Yeah, keep it up. I love the podcast.
Great. I appreciate it. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Clear Haze Exchange. New episodes drop every 2 weeks. You can catch Clear Haze Exchange on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and more. Let's clear the haze about sustainability and energy efficiency together. Subscribe now and join the conversation.